What if a simple waitress dared to confront the most feared millionaire in the entire region? On a rainy night, in a historic downtown restaurant, a humble woman did something that would forever change the life of the city's most powerful businessmen. Tell me, where are you watching from? If this story intrigues you as much as it intrigues me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button so more people can discover this incredible tale of love and transformation. The rain drummed against the centuries-old windows of the Williamsburg Tavern, its rhythm matching the heartbeats of those who witnessed what no one had dared before. Water streamed down the colonial-style glass panes, distorting the view of the cobblestone streets, where horse-drawn carriages still competed with modern vehicles in this historic district where time seemed suspended between eras. Inside, amber lights from iron chandeliers cast long shadows across wooden floors, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. The tavern smelled of polished oak, spilled whiskey, and the lingering aroma of half-baked bread. Every surface, from the hand-carved bar counter to the brass fixtures, told stories of a town proud of its heritage. Bartholomew Ashford sat at his usual corner table, his tailored charcoal suit and platinum cufflinks a stark contrast to the rustic surroundings. His presence commanded attention, not just because his companies employed half the town, but because power emanated from him like heat from fire. When he spoke, people listened. When he frowned, people trembled. "Incompetent fool," he muttered, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, as a young server named Thomas froze in horror at the bourbon droplets that had splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Is this how you treat a paying customer? Do you have any idea what this suit costs?" The tavern fell silent. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths, eyes lowered to plates. No one dared to look directly at the scene unfolding. No one except Seraphina Mitchell. She stood by the service counter, 30 years of life etched in the determined set of her shoulders. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, revealing a face that carried both softness and strength in equal measure. Her uniform, a white blouse and dark skirt, was simple but impeccably clean, pressed with the same care she applied to everything in her life. "I'll handle this," she whispered to Thomas, whose hands still trembled with the serving tray. As she crossed the room, time seemed to slow. The distance between the counter and Bartholomew's table stretched like a chasm no one had successfully bridged. Yet Seraphina walked with unwavering steps, her chin lifted slightly. Her eyes, a deep brown that often changed to amber in certain light, fixed firmly on the businessman. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice neither loud nor timid but clear as a church bell on Sunday morning. "You may have enough money to buy this entire tavern, but that doesn't give you the right to treat people as if they were invisible." The silence that followed was absolute, thick enough to touch. For the first time in decades, someone had confronted the man whose name adorned half the buildings in town. More shocking still, it was a waitress, a woman whose entire yearly salary wouldn't cover the cost of his wristwatch. Bartholomew's steel-grey eyes widened almost imperceptibly. His manicured hand, halfway to his crystal tumbler, paused. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, certainly, but also something deeper, something that resembled recognition, as though he were seeing clearly after a long fog. "I beg your pardon?" he finally said, his voice dangerously soft. "You heard me, sir," Seraphina continued, maintaining eye contact despite the flutter of fear in her chest. "Thomas is new. He made a mistake. A few drops of bourbon don't justify humiliating another human being." The businessman studied her for a long moment, taking in the hands reddened from hot water and work, the simple silver cross at her neck, the quiet dignity in her posture. Something about her triggered memories he'd spent a lifetime burying, memories of his own past, when his family had barely managed to keep food on the table, when his own father had worked double shifts at the mill until his back gave out. "I don't believe we've met," he finally said, neither apologizing nor escalating. "Seraphina Mitchell, I've worked here for 7 years. 7 years, he repeated, as if testing the weight of time. "And in all those years, has no one taught you the hierarchy of this town?" A half-smile touched her lips. "My grandmother taught me that true hierarchy has nothing to do with money, Mr. Ashford. It's about character." In that moment, something shifted in the universe of the tavern, something fundamental and irreversible, As lightning illuminated the windows behind them, casting dramatic shadows across the room, neither could have predicted how this single exchange would alter the course of their lives, setting in motion events that would eventually transform not just them, but the entire town. Sometimes the most profound journeys begin with a single moment of courage, when one voice rises above fear to speak a truth that cannot be unheard. The morning after the confrontation, Serafina woke before her alarm, the weight of potential consequences pressing on her chest. Sunlight filtered through the faded blue curtains of her bedroom in the old boarding house on Maple Street, casting dappled patterns across the patchwork quilt her mother had made for her 18th birthday. Outside, birds conducted their dawn chorus, oblivious to human concerns. She sat up, running her fingers through her loose hair, wondering if she would still have a job by day's end. The boarding house creaked around her, its wooden bones stretching in the morning warmth. From downstairs came the familiar sounds of her mother preparing breakfast, the gentle clatter of pots a comforting constant in a suddenly uncertain world. Her modest room contained few luxuries, but many treasures. Framed photographs of her family, books rescued from yard sales, a small desk where she kept meticulous records of household accounts. On the bedside table lay her most prized possession, a leather-bound journal filled with dreams, observations, and the business ideas she'd never had the opportunity to pursue. "Sarah?" Her mother's voice drifted up the stairs. "Are you awake, honey? The coffee's ready." In the kitchen, Eleanor Mitchell moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain. At 58, she carried the beauty of resilience, silver threaded through her dark hair, laugh lines framing eyes that had witnessed both joy and sorrow. After her husband's passing 5 years earlier, she had faced life with the same quiet determination she had passed to her daughter. "You look beautiful," Eleanor said from the doorway, her eyes bright with maternal pride and something deeper, a knowing recognition of the significance of the day. "It's just a memorial service," Serafina replied, though they both knew it was far more than that. A gentle knock at the front door sent a flutter through her chest. Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand before moving to answer it, her steps slow but determined despite the arthritis that had worsened in recent weeks. The tavern was unusually quiet that evening. Rain had returned, driving away the tourists who normally filled the historic district. Serafina moved between tables with practiced efficiency, grateful that Mr. Henderson had merely given her a stern warning rather than terminating her employment. His exact words, "You're lucky he didn't demand your job, but walk carefully, Sarah," hung in her mind as she worked. She had just delivered a shepherd's pie to a table of regulars when the door opened, bringing with it a gust of cool air and the unmistakable presence of Bartholomew Ashford. He stood in the entrance for a moment, raindrops glistening on his overcoat, scanning the room until his gaze settled on her. The tavern's ambient noise diminished as patrons recognized him. Mr. Henderson emerged from his office, adjusting his tie nervously as he approached the businessman. "Mr. Ashford, what an unexpected pleasure," he stammered. "Your usual table is available. I'll have our best server attend to you immediately." "Actually," Bartholomew said, his voice carrying across the room, "I'd prefer if Miss Mitchell handled my table this evening." Mr. Henderson's face cycled through confusion, alarm, and resignation in rapid succession. He glanced at Serafina with an expression that clearly communicated his concern. "Of course," he finally replied, motioning for Serafina to approach. She crossed the room with measured steps, aware of the eyes following her progress. Unlike yesterday, when righteous indignation had propelled her forward, tonight she felt a curious mixture of caution and intrigue. "Good evening, Mr. Ashford," she said professionally. "This way, please." She led him to his preferred corner table, situated beneath a painting of the Revolutionary War battle that had made Williamsburg famous. As he removed his expensive coat, she noticed he wasn't wearing a tie and his collar was unbuttoned, small details that somehow made him appear more human. "Would you like to start with your usual bourbon?" she asked, maintaining a polite distance. "You remember my usual order?" There was genuine curiosity in his voice. "You've been coming here every Thursday for 3 years," she replied matter-of-factly. 12-year-old bourbon, neat with water on the side. "You never touch the water." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Very observant, Miss Mitchell. It's my job to notice details." "Is that all it is? A job?" He gestured for her to bring the bourbon. Yesterday suggested you view it as something more. Serafina hesitated, then decided honesty was her only viable option. Every job deserves to be done with dignity, Mr. Ashford, both for those performing it and those receiving the service. When she returned with his drink, he surprised her by asking her to sit. The request was so unexpected that she glanced involuntarily toward Mr. Henderson, who was watching their interaction with undisguised anxiety. I have other tables, she explained. I've already spoken with your employer. He's arranged coverage. Bartholomew gestured to the chair across from him. Please, just for a moment. Cautiously, Serafina sat, keeping her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, the subtle signs of a man who carried more than just power. I owe you an apology, he said, the words clearly unfamiliar on his tongue. My behavior yesterday was inexcusable. Of all the scenarios Serafina had imagined, this hadn't been among them. She studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but found only a guarded vulnerability that intrigued her. May I ask what prompted this change of heart? She inquired. He turned the crystal tumbler in his hands, watching the amber liquid catch the light. Let's just say you reminded me of someone I used to know. And who might that be? A shadow passed over his features. Myself, perhaps. A very long time ago. He took a sip of his bourbon, then set the glass down deliberately. Tell me, Miss Mitchell, have you worked in hospitality your entire career? The question caught her off guard. No, she answered truthfully. I studied business administration at community college, but circumstances change and we adapt. Interest sharpened his gaze. What circumstances? Family responsibilities, she said simply, unwilling to elaborate on her personal life. Not everyone has the luxury of following their original path. Something in her words seemed to strike a chord with him. He nodded slowly as if confirming a private theory. The young man from yesterday. Thomas, was it? How is he? Nervous but grateful, she replied. It was his second day. Bartholomew reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the table between them. Please give this to him with my personal apology. Serafina made no move to touch the envelope. He doesn't need charity, Mr. Ashford, just respect. It's not charity, he corrected. It's acknowledgement of my error and the distress I caused. There's a difference. Their eyes met in silent evaluation, each measuring the other against some internal standard. The tavern continued its business around them, but at that table existed a separate reality, a space where two fundamentally different individuals recognized something familiar in each other. Very well, she finally said, taking the envelope. I'll make sure he receives it, along with your message. As she rose to leave, he surprised her again. I'll be returning tomorrow evening, Miss Mitchell. I find the atmosphere here unexpectedly refreshing. April arrived with a burst of dogwood blossoms and the cheerful yellow trumpets of daffodils pushing through the soil in the town square. Williamsburg transformed itself for spring, embracing tourists who flocked to witness history preserved in architecture and tradition. As Patriots' Day approached, the town buzzed with preparation. Flags appearing on porches, shopkeepers polishing windows, and rehearsals for the fife and drum corps echoing through the colonial district. For Serafina, April brought an unexpected rhythm to her life. Bartholomew Ashford had become a regular presence at the tavern, appearing 3 or 4 evenings each week, always requesting her table. Their interactions had evolved into something neither could properly define. Not quite friendship, but a mutual recognition that transcended their different stations in life. Through casual observations and town gossip, she had learned fragments of his story, how his family had once been respected members of the community before losing everything in a mill accident, how the boy from humble origins had transformed himself into the cold businessman feared throughout the region. For his part, Bartholomew had discovered Serafina's sacrifices, her abandoned business degree, her support of her ailing mother and college-bound younger sister Lisa, her quiet dedication to community service through St. Matthew's Methodist Church. On this particular evening, the tavern hummed with activity. A local historical society was hosting its monthly meeting in the back room, and tourists filled the remaining tables, eager to experience authentic colonial ambience. Serafina moved between her responsibilities with practiced grace, her mind partially occupied with the Patriots' Day committee meeting she would attend at St. Matthew's after her shift. When Bartholomew arrived, she noted subtle changes in his appearance. His suit, while still expertly tailored, was less formal. His demeanor, once rigidly authoritative, had softened around the edges. He nodded to several patrons as he made his way to his table, a courtesy he had never extended before. "Good evening, Ms. Mitchell," he greeted her, the formality of her surname now a private joke between them. "I see the Historical Society has invaded our territory tonight." She smiled at his use of "our," a small but significant indication of how he had come to view the tavern. "Mr. Hawkins is giving a presentation on the original families of Williamsburg. Apparently he's uncovered some previously unknown connections between the founding merchants. History has a way of revealing itself when we least expect it," Bartholomew remarked, a cryptic edge to his words. As she brought his usual bourbon, he surprised her by asking, "Will you join me for a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss." Curious, she sat across from him after ensuring her other tables were attended to. In the past weeks, these brief conversations had become moments she found herself anticipating, windows into a world beyond her daily responsibilities. "I understand you're involved with the Patriots' Day Celebration Committee," he began. Serafina tilted her head, wondering how he had acquired this information. "Yes, through St. Matthew's. We're coordinating the community breakfast and the children's historical pageant. I'd like to make a contribution," he said, sliding a folded check across the table, anonymously, if possible. She opened the check and nearly gasped at the amount, $25,000, enough to fund not just this year's celebration, but to establish an endowment for future years. Her eyes lifted to his, filled with questions. "Why anonymously?" she asked. "Most donors of this magnitude want their names on programs and banners." A shadow passed over his face. "Let's just say I prefer the substance of contribution over the recognition." "The Patriots' Day celebration was important to my mother," he admitted after a pause. "She believed in what it represented, not just independence from tyranny, but the creation of community, the idea that people from different backgrounds could build something meaningful together. It was the most personal information he had ever shared, a glimpse behind the curtain he kept firmly drawn across his past." Serafina recognized the significance of the moment, the trust it implied. "Then we'll honor that spirit," she promised, finally taking the check. "The committee meets in an hour at St. Matthew's. Would you like to attend?" The invitation surprised them both. For a moment, Bartholomew seemed genuinely tempted, longing visible in the softening of his expression. Then, like shutters closing against a storm, his professional mask returned. "Another time, perhaps," he said. "I have a conference call with investors in Singapore tonight." She nodded, accepting his retreat without comment. "Thank you for the contribution, Mr. Ashford. It will make a significant difference." As she moved away to attend to other tables, she felt his eyes following her, sensed the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Whatever was happening between them existed in a delicate balance, each revealing only fragments of themselves, testing the waters of trust. Later that night, as the committee meeting at St. Matthew's concluded, Pastor Williams pulled Serafina aside, his kind face alight with excitement. "I've just received the most extraordinary news," he said, leading her into his office where they could speak privately. "An anonymous donor has offered to cover the remaining medical bills for Mrs. Mitchell's treatment." Serafina froze, her mind racing. Her mother's rheumatoid arthritis had been worsening, the specialized treatments not fully covered by their limited insurance. The family had been quietly drowning in medical debt for years. "All of it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. That's over $30,000. "Paid in full," the pastor confirmed. The donor specifically requested that the family focus on Lisa's education without this additional burden. A mixture of gratitude and suspicion washed over her. Only one person could have orchestrated this, the same man who had somehow known about Thomas's mother's medical bills, who had returned to the tavern night after night, who had made an anonymous donation to a celebration that held personal significance. But how had he learned about her family's financial struggles? And more importantly, why did he care? Patriots' Day dawned clear and brilliant, the kind of spring morning that seemed designed for celebration. Serafina rose before sunrise, her mind already racing with last-minute details for the community breakfast. She dressed quickly, selecting a blue dress with small white stars embroidered around the collar, a nod to the day's patriotic theme. The kitchen of St. Matthew's Church buzzed with activity when she arrived. Volunteers bustled about, arranging long tables covered with red and white checkered cloths, setting up serving stations for pancakes and scrambled eggs, hanging the final pieces of bunting from the rafters of the parish hall. "Seraphina!" Pastor Williams called, waving her over to where he stood conferring with Mrs. Henderson, the tavern owner's wife. "We've had an unexpected development." "Is something wrong?" she asked, immediately alert for problems needing solutions. "Quite the opposite," Mrs. Henderson interjected, her round face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Ashford's company has just delivered enough additional food to feed twice our expected attendance, and they've sent staff to help serve." Seraphina glanced toward the kitchen, where indeed several unfamiliar workers in crisp white uniforms were efficiently organizing supplies. The scale of the contribution was impressive, but she felt a twinge of disappointment that Bartholomew had chosen to help from a distance rather than participate personally. The morning progressed in a whirlwind of activity. Families from throughout Williamsburg filled the parish hall, children with faces painted in patriotic colors darting between tables, elderly veterans proudly wearing their service medals, local politicians shaking hands and posing for photographs. The atmosphere was one of genuine community, something increasingly rare in an age of digital connection and individual pursuits. Seraphina was helping an elderly couple find seats when a collective murmur spread through the room, heads turning toward the entrance. Bartholomew Ashford stood in the doorway, but not in his usual business attire. Instead, he wore khaki pants and a simple blue button-down shirt, clothes that would have been unremarkable on anyone else but seemed revolutionary on him. More surprising still, he carried a large box of historical children's costumes, clearly intended for the pageant scheduled for that afternoon. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment everyone else seemed to fade into the background. Then Lisa appeared at Seraphina's side, clutching her arm in excitement. "Is that who I think it is?" she whispered. "The Bartholomew Ashford, looking like a normal human being and carrying costume props." "Apparently," Seraphina replied, equally astonished. Throughout the morning, she observed him from a distance as he helped set up for the children's pageant, answered questions about historical accuracy from curious parents, and even allowed 7-year-old Abigail Taylor to recruit him into fixing her Betsy Ross costume. The transformation from intimidating businessman to approachable community member left townspeople whispering behind their hands, revising long-held assumptions about the man whose name adorned half the buildings in town. As the breakfast crowd thinned and volunteers began cleaning up, Seraphina found a moment to approach him where he stood examining historical photographs displayed along one wall of the parish hall. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the additional food, the staff, the costumes, all of it." He didn't look away from the photographs. It was the right thing to do. "And yet it's not something you would have done a month ago," she observed. His gaze settled on a particular image, a black and white photograph from the 1950s, showing the church choir arranged on the steps of St. Matthew's. "People can change, Ms. Mitchell, when given sufficient reason." She followed his line of sight and noticed he was staring at a young woman in the second row of the choir, her face bright with joy as she sang. Something about the woman's features stirred recognition. "Is that my mother?" he confirmed quietly. "Sarah Ashford. She sang in this choir every Sunday until the mill closed and my father had to relocate us to find work." The revelation hung between them, weighted with significance. This was not merely a donation to a community event. It was a reconnection with buried roots, a hesitant step toward reclaiming a part of himself he had long denied. "Will you stay for the pageant?" she asked. He checked his watch, conflict evident in his expression. "I have a meeting with international investors at 3. "Of course," she said, hiding her disappointment. "Business comes first." "It always has," he agreed, but there was a note of regret in his voice that hadn't been there before. As he turned to leave, Seraphina made a decision. "Mr. Ashford," she called after him, "there's something I need to discuss with you. About my mother's medical bills." He paused, his back to her, shoulders tensing slightly. "What about them?" "I know what you did," she said quietly. "What I don't know is why." Slowly he turned to face her. "Does it matter?" "To me it does." For a long moment, They regarded each other across the emptying parish hall, the weight of unspoken words and feelings pressing between them. Then Bartholomew Ashford did something unprecedented. He offered honesty without calculation. "I lost my mother to a disease that could have been treated if we'd had the money," he said, his voice low and controlled. "No one should have to choose between medical care and education. Not Thomas's mother, not yours, not anyone's." The raw pain in his admission stripped away the last of Serafina's defenses. She saw him then not as the powerful businessman or the anonymous benefactor, but simply as a man carrying wounds that had never properly healed. "Join us for dinner," she said impulsively. "Tonight, at the boarding house. Nothing fancy, just a family meal. My mother makes an apple pie that would put the taverns to shame." Surprise registered in his eyes, followed by something that might have been longing. "I couldn't impose—" "It's not an imposition," she insisted. "It's a thank you, and perhaps—" She hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness, "Perhaps it's also an opportunity for you to spend Patriots' Day with people instead of alone in your office." The invitation hung between them, fragile and significant. Serafina realized she was holding her breath, waiting for his response with unexpected intensity. "What time?" he finally asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. 7 o'clock, 423 Maple Street, the blue boarding house with white trim." He nodded once, the gesture containing both acknowledgement and promise. Until tonight, then. The Mitchell family's quarters in the boarding house consisted of 3 modest rooms on the second floor, a small living area that doubled as a dining room, a compact kitchen with appliances that had seen better days, and 2 bedrooms shared among the 3 women. What the space lacked in size or luxury, it made up for in warmth. Family photographs lined the walls, handmade quilts draped over well-worn furniture, and the scent of Eleanor's baking filled the air with comfort. At precisely 7 o'clock, a knock sounded at their door. Serafina opened it to find Bartholomew standing in the hallway, still in his casual Patriots' Day attire, holding a bouquet of spring flowers and a bottle of wine. "Mr. Ashford," she greeted him, suddenly aware of how small their apartment must seem to someone accustomed to luxury. "Please come in." "Bartholomew, please," he corrected her gently. "If I'm to dine in your home, we should dispense with formalities." He stepped inside, his tall frame making the low-ceilinged room feel even smaller. His eyes moved around the space, taking in the worn furniture, the carefully mended curtains, the family photographs, not with judgment, but with genuine interest. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, approaching Eleanor and presenting the flowers. "Thank you for welcoming me into your home. I understand I have you to thank for your daughter's remarkable character." Eleanor, who had been watching him with the careful assessment of a mother protective of her children, softened visibly at his words. "How kind of you to say. And please call me Eleanor, these are beautiful," she added, accepting the bouquet. "And you must be Lisa," he continued, turning to the younger Mitchell. "Congratulations on your acceptance to the State University. The business program there is excellent." Lisa's eyes widened. "How did you know I was accepted to the business program?" A moment of awkward silence followed, before Bartholomew admitted, "I may have made some inquiries when arranging for your mother's medical fund. Forgive me if that seems intrusive." Instead of being offended, Lisa seemed impressed. "So you really do know everything that happens in this town?" "Not everything," he replied, with unexpected humility. "I'm discovering there's much I've been blind to for years." Dinner progressed with surprising ease. Eleanor's pot roast with spring vegetables was simple but delicious, and Bartholomew ate with evident appreciation, complimenting the food with sincerity rather than politeness. As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally, touching on the Patriots' Day celebrations, Lisa's university plans, and the history of Williamsburg. "This building has quite a story," Bartholomew remarked, glancing around the room. "It was originally the home of a colonial merchant, then served as a hospital during the Civil War, before being converted to a boarding house in the 1920s. "You seem to know a lot about it," Eleanor observed. A shadow crossed his face. "My father used to tell stories about the buildings in town. Before the mill accident, he was something of an amateur historian." "The mill accident," Lisa repeated. "Is that the one where several workers were injured when the old paper mill collapsed in the 70s? Bartholomew nodded, his expression guarded. "My father was one of them. His back was never the same. We lost our home, our standing in the community. Everything. The admission hung in the air, heavy with implications. Serafina began to understand more clearly the man sitting across from her, how the boy who had lost everything might become the man determined to control everything. "That must have been incredibly difficult," Eleanor said gently. "For all of you." "It shaped me," he acknowledged, meeting her compassionate gaze. "Not always in ways I'm proud of." The honesty of his response created a shift in the atmosphere, as if a barrier had been lowered. When Eleanor rose to serve her apple pie, Bartholomew insisted on helping despite her protests, carrying plates to the table with an ease that suggested he was not unfamiliar with such domestic tasks. As they enjoyed the warm pie with vanilla ice cream, Lisa asked the question that had clearly been on her mind all evening. "So, are you two dating?" Serafina nearly choked on her dessert. "Lisa, we're not." To her surprise, Bartholomew laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that transformed his usually serious face. "Your sister has your directness, Serafina." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice created a warmth that spread through her entire body. "We're friends," she finally managed, though the word seemed inadequate for the complex connection they had formed. "Friends," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose that's accurate, though it's been so long since I've had a genuine friendship that I might be out of practice." After dinner, as Eleanor and Lisa insisted on handling the cleanup, Serafina led Bartholomew to the small balcony off the living room. Night had fallen over Williamsburg, the historic district aglow with lanterns and the distant sound of patriotic music drifting from the town square where celebrations continued. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This evening has been illuminating." "In what way?" she asked, turning to study his profile in the dim light. He considered his words carefully. "I've spent decades building walls around myself, convincing myself that power and success were adequate substitutes for connection. Tonight reminded me of what I've been missing." His candor emboldened her to ask the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Why me, Bartholomew? Why did my standing up to you that night affect you so deeply?" He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-buried truth. "When I was a boy, after the accident, after we lost everything, I swore I would become so powerful that no one could ever hurt my family again. I built my empire brick by brick, decision by ruthless decision. Somewhere along the way, I became the very thing I had once despised, a man who valued money and power over people." He turned to face her fully, the moonlight silvering his features. "And then you stood before me, with nothing but your dignity and courage, and reminded me of who I used to be, who I might have been if I had made different choices." The honesty between them in that moment was more intimate than any physical touch. Serafina felt as if she were seeing him completely for the first time. Not the businessman, not the benefactor, but simply the man, with all his strengths and fractures laid bare. "It's not too late to make different choices," she said softly. His eyes held hers, searching for something. "Even for someone like me?" "Especially for someone like you," she insisted. "You have the resources to make real differences in people's lives, in this community." Today at the Patriots' Day celebration, I saw another side of you, the side that remembers what it means to be part of something larger than yourself. A vulnerability she had never witnessed before crossed his features. I'm not sure I remember how. Without thinking, Serafina reached out and took his hand, a simple gesture that bridged the vast differences in their lives and positions. His fingers closed around hers, warm and surprisingly strong. "Then let people help you remember," she said. "Let me help you remember." May brought gentle warmth to Williamsburg, coaxing roses into bloom throughout the historic district and drawing increasing numbers of tourists to the cobblestone streets. At the tavern, business thrived, with curious locals coming as much to witness the continuing evolution of Bartholomew Ashford's transformation as to enjoy the traditional fare and colonial atmosphere. For Serafina, the month marked a period of unexpected balance. Her work at the tavern, her involvement with St. Matthew's community programs, and her growing connection with Bartholomew, creating a rhythm that felt both surprising and somehow right. They had settled into a pattern of shared meals, thoughtful conversations, and gradual revelations that deepened their understanding of each other. On this particular afternoon, Serafina had the rare luxury of a day off. She had planned to help Pastor Williams with preparations for the upcoming Memorial Day ceremony at the Veterans Cemetery, organizing the traditional placement of flags on servicemen's graves. As she walked through the church garden, enjoying the scent of early roses, she was surprised to find Mrs. Abernathy, the town's 92-year-old historian, poring over documents spread across a table in the shade. "Seraphina, dear," the elderly woman called, waving her over with obvious excitement. "I'm so glad you're here. I've made the most remarkable discovery in the church archives." Curious, Seraphina joined her, noticing that the papers appeared to be medical records and correspondence from decades past. "What have you found?" she asked, drawn in by the historian's enthusiasm. "A connection," Mrs. Abernathy replied, her eyes bright behind her spectacles, "between your family and Mr. Ashford's, a connection none of us realized existed." With meticulous precision, she explained how the church had been digitizing its historical records as part of a preservation project. Among the documents were medical files from the Veterans Hospital that had operated on church grounds after World War I. "Your great-grandmother, Rose Mitchell, was a nurse there," Mrs. Abernathy explained, pointing to a staff photograph showing a young woman with Seraphina's eyes and determined chin. "And William Ashford, Bartholomew's grandfather, was a patient under her care." The revelation was surprising enough, but what followed truly astonished Seraphina. According to the medical records, Nurse Rose had been credited with saving William Ashford's life during a particularly difficult bout of pneumonia in 1919. "There's more," Mrs. Abernathy continued, her voice lowering as if sharing a precious secret. She carefully withdrew a yellowed envelope from a protective sleeve. This letter was tucked into William Ashford's Bible, which his widow later donated to the church library. It was written by your great-grandmother before she left Williamsburg for Georgia in 1921. With trembling hands, Seraphina accepted the fragile envelope. The handwriting on the outside, "Mr. William Ashford," was delicate but firm, much like her own. "May I?" she asked, indicating the letter within. Mrs. Abernathy nodded encouragingly. "Of course, dear. It belongs to your family's history as much as to the Ashfords." Carefully, Seraphina extracted the letter, unfolding the brittle paper with reverence for both its age and the connection it represented. As she read her great-grandmother's words, she felt a profound sense of recognition, as if hearing an echo of her own values across generations. "Dear Mr. Ashford, by the time you receive this letter, I will have left Williamsburg for my new home in Georgia. I wanted to express my gratitude for the wood carving you made for me. The little bluebird sits on my dresser and reminds me daily of the resilience of the human spirit. When you first came to the hospital, the doctors had little hope, but I recognized in you a fighter, a man determined to return to his family despite the wounds of war. Your recovery has been the greatest reward of my nursing career. You once asked why I became a nurse. I told you it was because of my father's illness, which is true. But what I didn't say was that I believe we are placed in each other's paths for reasons beyond our understanding. The patients I've tended have taught me more about courage and grace than I could ever have learned elsewhere. As you continue your recovery and return to your carpentry work, remember that the most beautiful creations often come from the most damaged materials. The Japanese have a practice called kintsugi, mending broken pottery with gold. The resulting piece is more valuable, more beautiful for having been broken. May your life be like that, Mr. Ashford. May you find that your wounds, rather than diminishing you, become the gold that makes you stronger and more beautiful than before. With deepest respect and friendship, Rose Mitchell. Tears pricked at Seraphina's eyes as she carefully refolded the letter. The wisdom and compassion in her great-grandmother's words, the belief in renewal after damage, in beauty emerging from brokenness, resonated deeply with her own journey and with what she had been witnessing in Bartholomew's transformation. "I need to show this to him," she said softly. "It's too significant not to share." Mrs. Abernathy patted her hand with understanding. "Some connections are meant to be discovered, dear. Perhaps this one has revealed itself at precisely the right moment." That evening, Bartholomew had invited Seraphina to dinner at his home, an invitation she had accepted with both curiosity and slight trepidation. She had never seen where he lived, and while she knew intellectually that it would be far grander than her family's modest apartment, She was unprepared for the reality of the Ashford estate on the outskirts of Williamsburg. The Georgian-style mansion stood on manicured grounds, its symmetrical facade and classical proportions conveying timeless elegance rather than ostentatious wealth. As her car approached the circular drive, Serafina felt a flutter of nervousness, wondering if she had made a mistake in coming, if the disparity between their worlds would become too apparent in this setting. Bartholomew himself opened the door before she could ring the bell, dressed not in his business attire, but in casual pants and a simple button-down shirt, as if deliberately trying to minimize the formality of the surroundings. "Welcome," he said, his smile genuine as he took in her simple blue dress and the leather portfolio she carried. "I hope you didn't have trouble finding the place." "Your directions were perfect," she replied, stepping into a foyer where a crystal chandelier illuminated marble floors and a graceful staircase, "though I didn't expect quite so much house." He laughed, the sound still surprising in its warmth. "Too much house, if I'm honest. Most of the rooms stand empty these days." As he gave her a brief tour, Serafina noticed something unexpected. Despite the mansion's grandeur, the spaces Bartholomew actually used were relatively modest and surprisingly personal. His study contained floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with historical volumes and literature. The smaller dining room where he had arranged for their meal featured family photographs rather than formal art. The kitchen, where a personal chef had prepared their dinner before discreetly departing, combined professional equipment with homey touches. "You seem surprised," he observed as they settled at the table, a simple but elegant meal of grilled salmon and spring vegetables before them. "I expected more ostentation," she admitted, "given your public image." "The public image was carefully constructed," he acknowledged, pouring wine into her glass. "A fortress of wealth and power designed to intimidate, but in private—" He gestured to the room around them, with its comfortable furnishings and personal mementos. "I've never entirely forgotten where I came from, even when I wanted to." The honesty in his admission created the perfect opening for what she had come to share. After they had begun their meal, Serafina carefully opened her portfolio and withdrew the protected letter. "There's something I discovered today," she began. "Something that suggests our lives have been connected long before that night at the tavern." With gentle reverence, she explained what Mrs. Abernathy had found, how her great-grandmother had nursed his grandfather back to health, how they had formed a connection strong enough that Rose's letter had been preserved among William's most precious possessions. When she handed him the letter, Bartholomew's hands trembled slightly as he accepted it. The emotion that crossed his face as he read Rose's words was complex: recognition, wonder, and a profound vulnerability that he made no attempt to hide. "Kintsugi," he said softly when he had finished reading, "mending with gold." "It seems our families have a history of helping each other heal," Serafina observed quietly. He carefully returned the letter to its protective sleeve, his movements deliberate as he processed the significance of this historical connection. "I have something to show you as well," he said finally, rising from the table. "Something I think you should see in light of this discovery." He led her to his study, where he unlocked a cabinet and withdrew a small wooden box. Opening it reverently, he revealed a carved bluebird, its details simple but exquisite, the wood darkened with age and handling. "This has been passed down through my family," he explained. "My father gave it to me when I left for college, telling me it was created by my grandfather for a special friend. I never knew the full story until now." Serafina gazed at the carving with wonder, recognizing it as the very one mentioned in Rose's letter. A tangible connection across generations, a physical manifestation of the bond between their families. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand. He placed the bluebird in her palm, the wood warm and smooth from decades of careful preservation. As she cradled this piece of shared history, Serafina felt as if invisible threads were being woven between them, creating a tapestry of connection that transcended their individual lives. "What does this mean?" she asked softly, looking up to meet his gaze. "For us, I mean." Bartholomew's expression was more open than she had ever seen it, the careful masks and defensive walls completely absent. "I think it means that what's happening between us isn't simply chance or coincidence. Perhaps we're continuing something that began long before we recognized each other's significance." The implication hung in the air between them. Not just that their current connection had historical precedent, but that it carried a certain rightness, a sense of fulfilling patterns established by their ancestors. The discovery didn't create their growing bond, but it illuminated it, casting their individual attraction in the context of a larger narrative. As they returned to their dinner, the conversation flowed with new ease, both of them sensing that the historical revelation had somehow accelerated their personal connection, allowing them to acknowledge the deepening significance of their relationship without awkwardness or uncertainty. Later, as Bartholomew walked Serafina to her car under a sky brilliant with stars, he paused, taking both her hands in his. "Memorial Day is this weekend," he said, his voice carrying a hint of vulnerability beneath its usual confidence. "My grandfather is buried in the Veterans Cemetery. Would you consider accompanying me to the ceremony? It seems fitting given what we've learned today." The invitation represented more than a social engagement. It was an acknowledgement of their shared heritage, an opportunity to honor the connection between their families, a step toward integrating their separate worlds. "I'd be honored," she replied simply, understanding all that remained unspoken in his request. As she drove back toward town, the lights of Williamsburg's historic district glowing in the distance, Serafina reflected on the extraordinary way her life had changed since that rainy March evening. What had begun as a moment of principled confrontation had evolved into something neither of them could have anticipated, a relationship that seemed to fulfill patterns established generations earlier, a connection that was healing wounds in both their lives. The letter from Rose Mitchell rested safely in her portfolio, but its wisdom echoed in her mind as she navigated the familiar streets toward home. Some connections are meant to be discovered at precisely the right moment. Sometimes the most beautiful creations emerge from the most damaged materials. Sometimes our wounds, rather than diminishing us, become the gold that makes us stronger and more beautiful than before. Memorial Day in Williamsburg dawned with solemn clarity, the sky a perfect blue canvas unmarred by clouds. Throughout the historic district, flags flew at half-mast until noon, in accordance with tradition. The morning air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and early summer roses as people made their way toward the Veterans Cemetery on the western edge of town. Serafina stood before her mirror, smoothing the fabric of her navy blue dress, simple but elegant, with a modest neckline and a hem that fell just below her knees. She had pinned her hair up in a more elaborate style than her usual practical bun, allowing a few soft tendrils to frame her face. The effect was subtle but transformative, highlighting the delicate architecture of her features. "You look beautiful," Eleanor said from the doorway, her eyes bright with maternal pride and something deeper, a knowing recognition of the significance of the day. "It's just a memorial service," Serafina replied, though they both knew it was far more than that. When Bartholomew arrived to collect her, his appreciation was evident in his expression as she descended the boarding house stairs. He himself cut an impressive figure in his dark suit, though Serafina had come to prefer him in the more casual attire he now frequently wore when away from corporate obligations. The Veterans Cemetery occupied a gentle hill overlooking the river, ancient oak trees providing dappled shade for the rows of white markers that stretched in solemn formation across the manicured grass. By the time Bartholomew and Serafina arrived, a sizable crowd had gathered near the central monument where the ceremony would take place. Their arrival together caused a ripple of interest among the townspeople. Though rumors had circulated for weeks about their relationship, this was their first public appearance as a pair at a significant community event. Serafina felt the weight of curious gazes, but focused instead on Bartholomew, whose expression had grown increasingly solemn as they approached the cemetery gates. "My grandfather is in the oldest section," he explained, guiding her along a path bordered by rose bushes in full bloom. "He served in World War I. My father used to bring me here every Memorial Day when I was a boy." The personal history shared in that simple statement revealed volumes about the man beside her, connections to Williamsburg that ran deeper than property deeds or business interests. They paused before a weathered headstone inscribed with the name William Ashford and the dates that framed his life. Bartholomew stood silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with ceremonial care, he removed a small American flag from his pocket and placed it in the ground beside the marker. "He was a carpenter before the war," he said quietly. "Afterward, he couldn't work with his hands anymore, too many injuries. That's when he took the job at the mill, Started as a janitor, worked his way up to floor manager by the time my father was born. Serafina remained silent, recognizing the gift of trust in these shared memories. Around them, other families moved among the graves, placing flowers and flags, children listening to stories of relatives they had never met, but whose sacrifices shaped their present. He used to tell me that a man's worth isn't in what he owns, Bartholomew continued, but in what he builds that outlasts him. A rueful smile touched his lips. Somewhere along the way I confused building with acquiring. As the ceremonial bugle sounded in the distance, signaling the beginning of the memorial service, they joined the gathering crowd. Throughout the solemn ceremony, the prayers for fallen soldiers, the testimonials from families, the traditional playing of taps, Serafina was acutely aware of Bartholomew beside her, of the historical connections they had discovered, of the strange workings of fate that had brought them together. After the formal ceremony concluded, Pastor Williams approached them, his clerical collar bright against his dark suit. "Serafina, Mr. Ashford, I was hoping to speak with you both." His expression held a mixture of excitement and hesitation that immediately captured their attention. "What is it?" Serafina asked. "It's about the waterfront development project," the pastor explained. "The Historical Society has been reviewing the plans, and we've discovered something significant about the property." Bartholomew's posture straightened, his business instincts immediately engaged. "What kind of discovery?" "Archaeological findings suggest that the eastern portion of the waterfront may contain the foundations of the original Ashford family business, a small distillery that operated before Prohibition. It would have been your great-grandfather's enterprise, I believe." The revelation clearly surprised Bartholomew. "I knew my family had been in Williamsburg for generations, but I had no idea they owned a business on the waterfront." "The mill connection overshadowed the earlier family history," Pastor Williams explained. "But Mrs. Abernathy found references in town records, and the archaeological survey seems to confirm the location. The implications of this discovery were significant for the development project that had been Bartholomew's focus for months. A luxury commercial and residential complex designed to revitalize the abandoned waterfront area. This could delay construction considerably," Bartholomew observed, his expression thoughtful rather than frustrated. "Archaeological sites require careful handling. Or it could present an opportunity," Serafina suggested, an idea forming as she considered the possibilities. "What if the development incorporated the historical discovery? A working distillery using traditional methods could become both a tourist attraction and a connection to Williamsburg's craft heritage." The suggestion sparked immediate interest in Bartholomew's eyes. "A business that honors the past while creating something new for the future." He turned to Pastor Williams. "Can you arrange a meeting with Mrs. Abernathy and the Historical Society? I'd like to learn everything possible about the original Ashford distillery." As they walked back toward town, after making arrangements for the meeting, Bartholomew seemed energized by the discovery, his mind clearly racing with possibilities for integrating this unexpected family connection into his business plans. "Would you consider attending the meeting with me?" he asked Serafina. "Your perspective on community integration would be valuable." The invitation represented yet another threshold in their evolving relationship, moving from personal connection into professional collaboration, acknowledging her insights as valuable to his business decisions. "I'd be happy to," she agreed, both honored by his trust and excited by the opportunity to contribute to a project that could benefit Williamsburg. They had just reached the edge of the historic district when a sleek black car pulled alongside them, stopping abruptly. The driver's window lowered to reveal Harrison Wells, Bartholomew's oldest board member and his father's former business partner. "Bartholomew," the silver-haired man called, his tone cordial but his eyes sharp as they took in Serafina beside him. "I've been trying to reach you all day. We have a situation at the office that requires immediate attention." Bartholomew's expression cooled noticeably. "Whatever it is can wait until tomorrow, Harrison. It's Memorial Day." "I'm afraid it can't," Wells insisted. "The Singapore investors are threatening to withdraw their support for the waterfront project unless we address their concerns immediately." A flash of annoyance crossed Bartholomew's face, quickly controlled. "Very well," he conceded, then turned to Serafina with genuine regret. "I'm sorry, duty calls." "I understand," she assured him. though she couldn't help noticing Wells's satisfied expression as Bartholomew moved toward the car. There was something calculated in the older man's interruption, a deliberate intrusion on their time together. "I'll call you this evening," Bartholomew promised, before sliding into the passenger seat. As the car pulled away, Serafina had the distinct impression that battle lines were being drawn, not between her and Bartholomew, but between the life he was beginning to envision and the business interests that had defined him for so long. Later that evening, as she worked her shift at the tavern, Thomas appeared at her side, his expression troubled. "There's a woman asking for you," he said quietly. "She says it's urgent." "I put her in the small private dining room." Curious and slightly concerned, Serafina made her way to the room at the back of the tavern, used primarily for small gatherings or discreet business meetings. A woman in her early 30s sat at the table, her designer clothes and perfect manicure marking her as someone from a different world than Serafina's. "Ms. Mitchell," the woman said, rising as Serafina entered, "I'm Victoria Wells. Harrison Wells is my father." The connection immediately put Serafina on alert. "How can I help you, Ms. Wells?" Victoria gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, sit. What I have to say concerns both of us, and Bartholomew Ashford." Reluctantly, Serafina sat, her waitress's apron suddenly feeling like inadequate armor for whatever this conversation might entail. "I'll be direct," Victoria continued, her manicured fingers tapping a manila folder on the table. "My father and several other board members have been conducting an investigation into Bartholomew's recent activities. They're concerned about his judgment and the direction he's taking the company." "That seems like a matter between Mr. Ashford and his board," Serafina replied carefully. "It would be, except for your involvement." Victoria opened the folder, revealing photographs. Bartholomew and Serafina walking together after the Memorial Day ceremony, sitting at her family's dinner table, standing close on the balcony of the boarding house. "Your relationship has become a focal point of their concerns." Serafina felt a chill despite the warm evening. "We're friends. There's no law against that." "Friends," Victoria repeated with a knowing smile. "Perhaps. But the board sees a powerful CEO being influenced by someone with potential financial motives. The anonymous donations to your mother's medical fund, your sister's coincidental scholarship, your sudden appearance at high-level business meetings, it creates a concerning pattern." Anger flared within Serafina. "If you're implying I'm manipulating him for money—" "I'm not implying anything," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "I'm simply sharing the narrative being constructed. A narrative that could damage not only Bartholomew's professional standing, but your reputation as well." The threat was thinly veiled, but unmistakable. Serafina studied the woman across from her, recognizing the calculated approach of someone accustomed to getting her way through intimidation. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked directly. Victoria closed the folder with deliberate care. "Because I believe you care about him. And if you do, you'll recognize that your continued association puts everything he's built at risk. The board is preparing a vote of no confidence, citing his emotional instability and questionable judgment. His entire legacy is in jeopardy." The words landed like physical blows, each one striking at Serafina's deepest fears, that her presence in Bartholomew's life might ultimately harm him, that the transformation she had witnessed and encouraged might cost him everything he had worked for. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she questioned, though she already knew the answer. "Create distance," Victoria replied simply. "Give him space to regain his focus and professional standing. If you truly care about his well-being, you'll recognize it's the only responsible choice." After Victoria left, Serafina remained in the private dining room, the weight of the conversation pressing on her chest until she could barely breathe. Every instinct rebelled against the manipulation she had just experienced, yet she couldn't dismiss the core concern. Was her presence in Bartholomew's life becoming an obstacle to his success and security? The question haunted her throughout her shift, through the mechanical motions of serving drinks and clearing tables, through forced smiles and automatic responses to customers' requests. By closing time, a leaden certainty had settled in her heart. She needed to protect him, even if that meant stepping away. The following morning, Serafina composed a carefully worded letter, explaining her decision to create distance between them, citing concerns about the professional complications their friendship had created. The words felt hollow and insufficient, but she could see no alternative that wouldn't ultimately cause him greater harm. She delivered the letter to Margaret at Ashford Corporation, unable to face him directly, then threw herself into work and family responsibilities with renewed intensity, as if activity could fill the sudden void his absence created in her life. Days passed without contact. She learned through town gossip that Bartholomew had been seen at corporate events in Richmond, photographed with business associates and political figures, apparently refocused on his professional obligations. The waterfront project continued to move forward, though rumors suggested the plans were being modified to accommodate archaeological findings. June faded into July, bringing Independence Day preparations and a heatwave that left the town languid and irritable. Serafina moved through her days with mechanical precision, ignoring the concerned glances from her mother and sister, deflecting questions about Bartholomew's absence from their lives. It was Eleanor who finally broke through her carefully maintained facade, finding her one evening on the balcony, staring unseeing at the fireflies that danced among the trees along Maple Street. "You're punishing yourself for something," her mother observed, settling carefully into the chair beside her. "And him too, I suspect." "It's complicated," Serafina replied, the inadequate phrase tasting bitter on her tongue. "Love usually is," Eleanor said simply. "But that doesn't mean we solve complications by running away from them." Serafina turned to her mother in surprise. "I never said anything about love." A knowing smile touched Eleanor's lips. "You didn't have to, dear. It's been written on your face for months now." The simple observation broke something inside her, the careful wall she had constructed around her feelings, the rationalization that their connection was merely friendship or mutual respect. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the truth she had been avoiding rose to the surface. "I do love him," she admitted, the words barely audible. "Which is exactly why I had to step away. His board members, his business partners, they were using me to undermine him. I was becoming a liability." Eleanor listened as Serafina explained Victoria's visit, the implied threats, the fear that had driven her decision. When she finished, her mother was silent for a long moment, considering her response with characteristic care. "Do you remember what your father used to say about fear-based decisions?" she finally asked. Serafina nodded, a lump forming in her throat at the memory of her father's gentle wisdom. "He said they almost always lead us away from our truest path." "Exactly." Eleanor took her daughter's hand, her fingers warm despite the arthritis that gnarled them. "You made this decision out of fear. Fear for him, yes, but fear nonetheless. And in doing so you made his choice for him, without giving him the dignity of making it himself." The insight struck Serafina with the force of revelation. In trying to protect Bartholomew, she had denied him agency in their relationship, had assumed he couldn't or wouldn't stand against the pressures surrounding him. "What should I do?" she whispered, feeling lost in a way she hadn't since her father's death. "What you've always done," Eleanor replied simply. "Face the truth with courage, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." The conversation left Serafina restless and conflicted. As dawn broke the following morning, she made her decision. She would speak with Bartholomew directly, explain her fears and motivations, and accept whatever response he offered, even if that meant confirming their permanent separation. She was preparing for her shift at the tavern when Lisa burst into their apartment, breathless and wide-eyed. "Have you seen the news?" she demanded, thrusting her phone toward Serafina. "It's all over the local stations." The screen showed a live news broadcast from outside Ashford Corporation headquarters. The caption read, "Breaking hostile takeover attempt at Ashford Corp. CEO Bartholomew Ashford fights to retain control." Serafina felt the blood drain from her face as the reporter explained that a coalition of board members led by Harrison Wells had initiated proceedings to remove Bartholomew from leadership, citing erratic decision-making and concerning personal entanglements that allegedly compromised his business judgment. "They're talking about you," Lisa said, her voice hushed with disbelief. "They're using your relationship with him as justification for taking his company." The realization that her worst fears had materialized, that her presence in his life had indeed created the vulnerability his enemies needed, settled like ice in Serafina's stomach. She had stepped away to prevent exactly this outcome, yet her absence had only emboldened those who sought to undermine him. "I need to go to him," she said, already reaching for her purse. What can you possibly do? Lisa asked. This is high-level corporate warfare. Serafina paused at the door, a newfound clarity guiding her response. I can stand beside him, the way he stood beside me when I needed support. The rest is up to him, it always was. Chaos greeted her at Ashford Corporation headquarters. News vans lined the circular drive, reporters with microphones positioned strategically near the entrance, security personnel creating a human barrier between the media and the building's revolving doors. The atmosphere crackled with the electric tension that surrounds unfolding drama. She approached hesitantly, uncertain how to navigate this unfamiliar territory. A security guard blocked her path as she neared the entrance. I'm sorry, ma'am. The building is closed to the public today. I need to see Bartholomew Ashford, she explained, aware of how inadequate the statement sounded. Please, it's important. The guard's expression remained impassive. Mr. Ashford isn't taking visitors. If you have business with the corporation, you'll need to return another day. Frustration welled within her. She had come this far, propelled by the certainty that she needed to see him, yet found herself powerless against the protective barriers of his world. Serafina? She turned to find Margaret, Bartholomew's executive assistant, emerging from a side entrance, her usually impeccable appearance showing signs of strain. Margaret, I need to see him, please. The older woman studied her for a moment, measuring something in her expression. He's in the middle of crisis meetings. The situation is delicate. I understand, Serafina said, but I think I may have inadvertently contributed to this situation. I need to speak with him, even if it's just for a moment. Something in her plea must have resonated with Margaret, who after a brief hesitation gestured toward the side entrance. Come with me quickly, before the reporters notice. They slipped inside, bypassing the main lobby for a service elevator that Margaret accessed with a keycard. As they ascended toward the executive floor, Serafina gathered her courage, still uncertain what she would say, but knowing she needed to offer the truth about her withdrawal, about Victoria's visit, about the feelings she had been too afraid to acknowledge. The elevator opened directly into a conference room where a heated discussion was underway. Through glass walls, Serafina could see Bartholomew standing at the head of a table, surrounded by lawyers and executives, his posture rigid with tension as he reviewed documents spread before him. He looked exhausted, the strain of the past weeks evident in the shadows beneath his eyes and the tightness around his mouth. Margaret approached him, speaking quietly near his ear. His head snapped up, eyes searching, until they found Serafina standing uncertainly by the elevator. For a moment his professional mask slipped, revealing such raw emotion that she nearly lost her resolve. He excused himself from the meeting, crossing to where she waited with measured steps that betrayed nothing to the watching executives. Only when the conference room door closed behind him did his control falter. Serafina, he said, her name carrying weeks of unspoken questions. Why are you here? I heard the news, she replied, suddenly aware of the inadequacy of any explanation she might offer. I needed to see you, to tell you— That you're sorry? He interrupted, an edge of bitterness creeping into his voice. That you regret becoming involved with someone whose life is constantly under scrutiny. I received your letter, Serafina. Your position was quite clear. The distance between them, emotional rather than physical, felt insurmountable. She had anticipated anger, perhaps, or cold dismissal, but not this wounded defensiveness that suggested her absence had cut far deeper than she had imagined. Victoria Wells came to see me, she said directly, watching his expression shift from guarded to alert. She showed me photographs, suggested that our relationship was damaging your professional standing, implied that the board was preparing to move against you because of me. Understanding dawned in his eyes. And you believed her? I believed I was protecting you, Serafina corrected, her voice breaking slightly. I thought by stepping away, I could remove their ammunition against you. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Bartholomew turned away, moving to the window that overlooked the town below, the historic district where they had walked together, the river that had witnessed their growing connection, the community that had observed their unexpected relationship with curiosity and speculation. The board's move has nothing to do with you, he said finally. Not directly, at least. Victoria and her father have been orchestrating this for months, gathering support among shareholders who question my new direction for the company. You were simply a convenient narrative they could exploit, the vulnerable CEO manipulated by an opportunistic woman. The characterization stung, even knowing it wasn't his personal view. And now? He turned back to face her, his expression softening slightly. Now I fight. The waterfront project gives me leverage. It's too profitable for the shareholders to abandon. I have allies on the board, support from key investors. It's not over. Relief washed through her, followed immediately by determination. How can I help? Surprise registered in his features. You still want to? After everything this has cost you? The scrutiny, the gossip, the interference in your life? None of that matters, she said simply. What matters is that I walked away when I should have stayed and fought beside you. I let fear make my decisions, and I regret that more than anything. The admission hung between them, freighted with implications neither had directly addressed. Bartholomew studied her for a long moment, as if seeing beyond her words to the emotions beneath. Why did you really come today, Serafina? The directness of the question demanded equal honesty in response. She took a deep breath, summoning the courage her mother had reminded her was her truest inheritance. Because I love you, she said quietly, and because walking away from that truth has been the greatest mistake of my life. Time seemed suspended as her words registered. Then Bartholomew crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, gathering her into an embrace that conveyed everything words could not: relief, forgiveness, longing, and a depth of feeling that matched her own. I have been half alive these past weeks, he murmured against her hair, functioning but hollow, moving through obligations without purpose or joy. She drew back slightly to see his face, finding in his expression the vulnerability he showed to no one else. I'm sorry, I thought I was protecting you. By denying us both what we truly wanted. He shook his head, a rueful smile touching his lips. We've been quite the pair of fools, haven't we? A discreet knock interrupted the moment. Margaret opened the door just enough to deliver her message. Mr. Ashford, the emergency board meeting begins in 20 minutes. Legal counsel suggests you review the shareholder statements before entering. Evening had fallen by the time the emergency board meeting concluded. The tavern was unusually quiet for a summer night, most of the regulars having departed early. Sensing Serafina's distraction as she moved mechanically between tables, her mind fixed on the corporate drama unfolding across town. She had just begun closing procedures when the door opened, bringing with it the unmistakable presence of Bartholomew Ashford. His silhouette stood framed against the gaslit street beyond, his posture straight but not rigid, carrying dignity rather than tension. The few remaining patrons looked up with undisguised curiosity as he crossed to the bar where Serafina stood polishing glasses, all eyes following his progress. It's done, he said simply when he reached her. The vote? She asked, her heart in her throat. A tired smile touched his lips. 17-7 in my favor. Wells and his faction have been removed from the board. The Singapore investors stayed loyal, and several key shareholders made statements of support. Relief swept through her. Congratulations. Don't congratulate me yet, he replied, his expression shifting to something more serious. I've made another decision today, one that may prove more significant in the long run. Before she could question him further, he turned to address Mr. Henderson, who had emerged from his office at the commotion. I'd like to speak with all your staff if possible, Bartholomew requested. What I have to say concerns everyone here. Curious and slightly concerned, Serafina watched as the tavern employees gathered. Servers, bartenders, kitchen staff, all eyeing the businessman with varying degrees of wariness and interest. For generations, this tavern has been the heart of Williamsburg, Bartholomew began, his voice carrying easily in the hushed room. My own grandfather used to tell stories of community gatherings here, of decisions made and friendships formed over drinks and honest conversation. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled staff before returning to Serafina. Today I've established the Williamsburg Heritage Trust, a non-profit foundation dedicated to preserving the town's historic businesses and traditions. Its first act will be to purchase this building, not to change it, but to protect it from ever being altered or demolished. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the room. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, confusion evident in his expression. Are you saying you're buying the tavern, Mr. Ashford? No, Bartholomew corrected. The trust is buying the building. You will continue to own and operate the tavern exactly as you have been. The only difference is that the property will be permanently protected from development or significant alteration. The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on anyone present. For years, small business owners in Williamsburg had lived with the fear that their historic properties might eventually be purchased by developers and transformed beyond recognition. Bartholomew's creation of the trust represented a fundamental shift in the town's future: preservation over profit, community over commerce. Additionally, he continued, the trust will establish a scholarship fund for employees of historic district businesses and their families, covering education costs for those who might otherwise be unable to afford it. His gaze found Thomas, whose mother's medical bills he had covered months before. Sometimes talent and ambition are constrained not by ability, but by circumstance. This community has shown me the value of investing in people rather than merely in properties. As the implications of his announcement registered, the atmosphere in the tavern transformed from wary curiosity to cautious celebration. Mr. Henderson pumped Bartholomew's hand enthusiastically. Kitchen staff exchanged excited whispers about educational opportunities, and regular patrons raised glasses in impromptu toasts. Amidst the growing celebration, Bartholomew made his way back to Serafina, who had watched the proceedings with a mixture of pride and amazement. "You've changed everything," she said softly, when he reached her side. "For them, for the town, for yourself, for us," he corrected, taking her hand. "None of this would have happened without you. You showed me that true legacy isn't measured in buildings owned or profits generated, but in lives improved and communities strengthened." Around them, the tavern hummed with excited conversation, the news of the trust's establishment already spreading beyond its walls through text messages and phone calls. The story would be throughout Williamsburg by morning, how the town's most powerful businessman had transformed from feared tycoon to community benefactor, how the tavern confrontation months ago had sparked a change that would reshape the town's future. Yet in that moment, standing beside the man whose journey had become intertwined with her own, Serafina found herself focused not on the public transformation, but on the private one, the walls that had fallen between them, the truth they had finally acknowledged, the possibility that stretched before them like an unopened gift. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing the question she had posed at the Veterans Cemetery, but with new meaning in this transformed context. "Now we build something worthy of everything that brought us to this moment, worthy of your courage that first night, worthy of the connection between our families across generations, worthy of the community that shaped us both in different ways." As the tavern continued its impromptu celebration around them, Serafina recognized that they stood at a threshold, not just between their separate pasts and a potential shared future, but between fear and possibility, between safety and risk, between the comfortable known and the exhilarating unknown. Bartholomew's answer was both simple and profound. "I'm ready," she said, the words a commitment to whatever path they would forge together. His smile, genuine, unguarded, transformed from the cold expression he had worn when they first met, was answer enough. August arrived with shimmering heat that transformed Williamsburg into a tableau of contrasts. Tourists in modern summer attire wandering through streets where historical reenactors in colonial garb demonstrated traditional crafts, the past and present coexisting in vibrant harmony. Throughout the town, preparations for the annual Harvest Festival had begun, with committees forming and traditions being dusted off for another year. For Serafina, the month brought changes that once would have seemed impossible. The most immediate was professional. Bartholomew had asked her to serve as executive director of the newly established Williamsburg Heritage Trust, a position that would allow her to utilize her business education while working directly with the community she loved. "I can't accept," she had initially protested when he proposed the idea over dinner at her family's apartment. "People will say I got the position because of our relationship." "People will talk regardless," he had replied with the pragmatism that characterized his business decisions. "The question is whether you'll let their talk prevent you from doing work you're uniquely qualified for, work that could transform this town." After discussing the opportunity with her mother and sister, both of whom had encouraged her to accept, Serafina had finally agreed. Her first official day at the Trust's newly established office, a restored colonial building on Market Street, coincided with the Harvest Festival Planning Committee's initial meeting. As she stood before the assembled committee members in the Trust's conference room, Serafina felt a momentary flutter of anxiety. Many of these people had known her only as a tavern waitress. Now she addressed them as the director of a foundation with significant resources and influence. "Thank you all for coming," she began, drawing confidence from her thorough preparation. "The Trust is honored to support this year's festival, but we want to be clear. Our role is to provide resources and assistance, not to change traditions that have meaning for this community." Her approach immediately set the tone for a collaborative rather than directive relationship. As the meeting progressed, she guided discussions about expanding the festival to include demonstrations of traditional crafts that were fading from common knowledge, creating educational opportunities for children, and ensuring that local businesses benefited from the increased tourism. "The goal," she explained, "is to celebrate our heritage while strengthening our present community. Tradition shouldn't be a museum piece. It should be a living, evolving connection between generations." Pastor Williams, who had chaired the committee for years, regarded her with undisguised approval. "I believe your great-grandmother would be proud to see you continuing her legacy of community service, though in a very different capacity." The reference to Rose Mitchell, whose letter had revealed the historic connection between Serafina's and Bartholomew's families, created a moment of reflection. How strange and wonderful that threads from the past could weave so unexpectedly into the present, creating patterns no one could have anticipated. After the meeting concluded, Serafina remained in her new office, still adjusting to the space that reflected both history and possibility. The antique desk that had been restored by local craftsmen, the modern computer that connected her to resources throughout the region, the large windows overlooking Market Street, where Williamsburg life unfolded in its daily rhythms. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret, who had transferred from Ashford Corporation to serve as the Trust's administrative director, appeared with a stack of documents. "The paperwork for the Johnson property is ready for your review," she said, placing the folder on Serafina's desk. "And Mr. Ashford asked me to remind you about dinner tonight at the Governor's Mansion in Richmond. The car will collect you at 6. The reminder sent a fresh wave of nervous anticipation through Serafina. Tonight would mark her first appearance with Bartholomew at a major political event, a fundraising dinner for historic preservation throughout Virginia. Their relationship, once the subject of local gossip, would now enter a more public arena. As evening approached, Serafina stood in her bedroom at the boarding house preparing for the governor's dinner. Lisa sat cross-legged on the bed, watching as Serafina tried on the third dress option, a midnight blue gown with a modest neckline and elegant simplicity that complemented her natural beauty without ostentation. "That's the one," Lisa declared decisively. "You look like you belong exactly where you're going without trying too hard to fit in." Serafina studied her reflection critically. The woman in the mirror seemed both familiar and strange, still herself, yet transformed by circumstances and choices that had altered the trajectory of her life in ways she never could have predicted 6 months ago. "Do I belong there, though?" she wondered aloud. "Among politicians and wealthy donors, discussing historical preservation as if I've been doing it for years rather than weeks." Lisa rose to stand beside her sister, their reflections side by side in the mirror. Similar in features but different in spirit, Lisa's natural confidence contrasting with Serafina's more thoughtful approach. "You've been preserving things your whole life," Lisa pointed out. "This family, for starters, our home, the traditions Mom taught us. You're just doing it on a larger scale now with more resources." The observation carried wisdom beyond Lisa's 19 years. Serafina squeezed her sister's hand in silent gratitude, then turned her attention to the final preparations. The simple pearl earrings that had become her signature accessory, a touch of lipstick, her grandmother's delicate silver bracelet that connected her to her roots even as she stepped into new territory. When Bartholomew arrived to collect her, his appreciation was evident in his expression as she descended the boarding house stairs. He himself cut an impressive figure in his tailored tuxedo, though Serafina had come to prefer him in the more casual attire he now frequently wore when away from corporate obligations. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm as they walked to the waiting car. The drive to Richmond passed quickly, filled with comfortable conversation about their respective days, plans for the Trust's upcoming initiatives, and light-hearted observations about the peculiarities of bureaucracy they both navigated in different contexts. Their relationship had settled into a rhythm that balanced the professional and personal with increasing ease, each supporting the other's work while maintaining their individual perspectives. As they approached the governor's mansion, however, Serafina felt her anxiety returning. The imposing colonial structure, illuminated against the evening sky, represented a world she had observed only from a distance until now. Bartholomew sensed her tension and covered her hand with his own. "Remember," he said quietly, "you're not here as my guest or companion. You're the executive director of a significant new foundation focused on historic preservation, exactly the kind of person who belongs at this event." His reminder of her professional standing, rather than their personal relationship, provided exactly the perspective she needed. As they entered the elegant reception hall, Serafina straightened her shoulders and prepared to represent not only herself, but the community and values that had shaped her. The evening unfolded more smoothly than she had anticipated. Years of interacting with diverse tavern patrons had honed her ability to engage in conversation with virtually anyone, finding common ground even with those whose lives differed dramatically from her own. She moved between discussions about preservation techniques, community engagement strategies, and the economic benefits of historical tourism, with growing confidence, earning thoughtful nods from state officials and preservationists with decades of experience. "You're making quite an impression," Bartholomew murmured during a brief moment alone as they stood near the mansion's terrace doors. "The State Historical Society director has asked for your contact information twice." She smiled, feeling more at ease than she had imagined possible in this environment. It turns out that listening to people's stories at the tavern for 7 years was excellent preparation for development work. Everyone wants to be heard, whether they're ordering bourbon or donating millions to preservation. Their moment of private connection was interrupted by the approach of an elegant older couple, the woman impeccably styled in a classic gown that spoke of old money and refined taste. The man distinguished in his formal attire, his bearing suggesting military background despite his advanced age. "Bartholomew," the woman said warmly, extending her hand. "How wonderful to see you here. It's been far too long." "Aunt Catherine, Uncle James," Bartholomew greeted them, his tone conveying genuine affection. "I'd like you to meet Serafina Mitchell, Executive Director of the Williamsburg Heritage Trust. Serafina, my aunt and uncle, Catherine and James Ashford." Surprise registered briefly in Serafina's expression before she recovered her composure, extending her hand with a warm smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you both." "The pleasure is ours," Catherine replied, studying Serafina with undisguised interest. "We've heard so much about you and your work with the Trust. Bartholomew speaks very highly of your vision for preservation." The conversation that followed revealed aspects of Bartholomew's family history that Serafina had never heard, how Catherine, his father's sister, and her husband James had maintained the family's military and social connections even after the mill accident that had altered his parents' circumstances so dramatically. Though they had offered financial assistance, Bartholomew's father had been too proud to accept, creating a distance that had only recently begun to heal. "We always knew he would find his way back to what truly matters," Catherine confided to Serafina, as the men discussed a military preservation project nearby. "Bartholomew was such a thoughtful boy before hardship forced him to become hard. I see that thoughtfulness returning now, thanks in no small part to your influence, I suspect." The insight into Bartholomew's childhood touched Serafina deeply. "I think we've influenced each other," she replied carefully. "Sometimes we need someone else to reflect back the parts of ourselves we've forgotten." Catherine's approving smile suggested she recognized the wisdom in Serafina's response. "You must join us for dinner at our home in Charlottesville soon. James has been collecting historical documents related to Williamsburg for decades, materials that might be valuable for your preservation work." By the time they departed the governor's mansion late that evening, Serafina had collected not only Catherine and James's invitation, but also contact information from the State Historical Society, 2 preservation architects, and the director of a grant-making foundation interested in the Trust's work. More importantly, she had gained confidence in her ability to navigate these new professional waters without losing sight of the values and perspectives that made her contribution unique. As their car glided through the nighttime landscape back toward Williamsburg, Bartholomew regarded her with evident pride. "You were magnificent tonight," he said. "Completely yourself, yet perfectly adapted to the environment." "I had an excellent teacher," she replied, settling comfortably against his shoulder. "Someone who showed me that authentic transformation doesn't mean abandoning your core self, but rather rediscovering it beneath the roles and expectations that accumulate over time." He recognized his own journey in her words and acknowledged it with a thoughtful nod. "We're building something important, aren't we? Not just the trust or the waterfront project, but a different way of engaging with the world." The observation captured exactly what had been evolving between them, a partnership that transcended traditional categories, encompassing the personal and professional, the emotional and practical, creating something neither could have achieved alone. "Foundation stones," she agreed, remembering the discussion from the Harvest Festival meeting earlier that day. "Strong enough to support whatever we choose to build, but flexible enough to adapt as we grow." September transformed Williamsburg with subtle alchemy, summer's heavy heat giving way to crisp mornings and golden afternoons, maple trees along Duke of Gloucester Street beginning their annual transition from green to crimson, farmers' market stalls overflowing with the season's bounty. As the Harvest Festival approached, the town vibrated with anticipation and preparation. For Serafina, the month marked significant transitions in both her professional and personal life. The trust had successfully completed its first major acquisition, the Johnson farmhouse and surrounding acreage, which would be preserved as a living history site demonstrating traditional agricultural practices. More significantly, she and her family had moved from the cramped boarding house apartment into a charming colonial home near the edge of the historic district, purchased with her new salary and with Bartholomew's discreet assistance with the down payment. The house represented not charity but partnership, a bridge between their formerly separate worlds that acknowledged both her independence and their deepening connection. With 3 bedrooms, a sunny kitchen that delighted Eleanor, and a small garden where Lisa had immediately begun planting herbs, the home provided space for each Mitchell woman to flourish while remaining connected as a family. On this particular evening, with the Harvest Festival just 3 days away, Serafina stood in that garden, surveying the lanterns she had strung between trees in preparation for the small dinner party they were hosting. The table on the brick patio was set for 6. Bartholomew would be arriving shortly, along with Pastor and Mrs. Williams, and Catherine and James Ashford, who had become unexpected but welcome additions to their expanding circle. As sunset approached, Bartholomew arrived carrying a wooden crate that he set carefully on a side table. His eyes held a mixture of excitement and nostalgia as he opened it to reveal bottles of amber liquid, their labels bearing an unfamiliar crest with the words Ashford Mill Distillery in elegant script. "My grandfather's recipe," he explained, lifting one bottle reverently. Before the mill, the Ashfords were known for their small-batch bourbon. When the property was sold, the recipe was lost, or so everyone thought. Until, Serafina prompted, intrigued by this new piece of his family history. "Until I found my father's papers during the office renovation last month," Bartholomew continued. Hidden in an old accounting ledger was the original formula, along with notes about aging processes and grain selections specific to Virginia soil. He uncorked the bottle, the rich aroma of quality bourbon immediately enhancing the evening air. "This is the first batch produced from that recipe in over 50 years. The new Ashford Mill Distillery will open next spring on the eastern portion of the waterfront development, a working historical exhibit that creates jobs while preserving traditional craftsmanship." The significance of the moment wasn't lost on Serafina. Bartholomew wasn't merely reviving a family tradition, he was reconnecting with the authentic heritage his ancestors had valued before financial pressures forced them into industrial work. The mill that had ultimately claimed his father's health and altered his family's trajectory was being symbolically reclaimed and transformed. "To new beginnings rooted in honored traditions," she proposed as he poured a small tasting for her. The toast perfectly captured the spirit of the evening that followed, as their guests arrived, and conversation flowed easily between topics both personal and philosophical. James shared historical documents related to the original Ashford distillery, while Pastor Williams discussed how the upcoming Harvest Festival was incorporating more educational elements about traditional crafts and practices. After their guests departed, Bartholomew remained behind, helping clear the table despite Eleanor's protests that guests shouldn't work. "I stopped being merely a guest in this home some time ago," he reminded her gently. "At least I hope so." His comment carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on Eleanor, who exchanged a knowing glance with Serafina before tactfully suggesting that Lisa help her with the dessert plates in the kitchen, leaving Bartholomew and Serafina alone in the lantern-lit garden. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the evening's success creating a peaceful contentment between them. Then Bartholomew reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. "There's something else I found in my father's papers," he said, his voice carrying an emotion Serafina hadn't heard before. "Something I believe was meant to find its way to you." Curious, she accepted the pouch, opening it carefully to reveal a delicate silver ring, set with a small but perfect sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. The vintage piece caught the lantern light, sending prisms dancing across the table between them. "It was my grandmother's," Bartholomew explained, his voice soft with reverence. "The one Rose Mitchell nursed back to health. According to my father's notes, my grandfather designed it himself after returning to his carpentry work, sketched the setting, and commissioned a local silversmith to create it as a symbol of their new beginning after the war. The historical significance of the piece alone would have made it precious, but Serafina sensed there was more to this moment than shared heritage. Her heart quickened as Bartholomew took her hand, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "When I found it, I knew immediately that it belonged with you," he continued, "not just because of our family's connection, but because it represents exactly what you've helped me rediscover, the value of creating rather than merely acquiring, of building something meaningful and lasting." He paused, gathering himself for words that clearly held profound significance for him. "I'm not asking anything of you tonight except that you keep this ring as a symbol of everything we've found together. If the time comes that you might consider a more formal commitment between us, it would honor me greatly if you would wear it." The approach was so characteristic of him, respectful of her independence, cognizant of the relatively brief time they had known each other, yet clear in his intentions and hopes. It was neither a formal proposal nor a casual gift, but something uniquely suited to their particular relationship and circumstances. Serafina cradled the ring in her palm, feeling the weight of history and possibility it represented. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "and meaningful in ways a new ring could never be." She closed her hand around it, a gesture of acceptance that acknowledged both the gift and the unspoken promise it contained. "When the time is right," she agreed, meeting his gaze with equal measures of certainty and prudence, "this is exactly what I would want to symbolize our commitment." Understanding passed between them, appreciation for the present moment without rushing toward formal declarations, recognition of the direction their relationship was taking without artificially accelerating its natural evolution, respect for the significance of the step they were both contemplating. Bartholomew's relief and joy were evident in his smile, not the controlled expression he presented in business settings, but the genuine warmth he had rediscovered through their connection. "I should go," he said, rising reluctantly. "Tomorrow will be busy for both of us with the festival preparations." At the garden gate he paused, turning back to where she stood illuminated by lantern light, the velvet pouch still clutched in her hand. "Serafina," he said, her name a caress in his voice, "thank you for helping me find my way back to what matters." "We found our way together," she corrected gently, "and we'll continue finding it day by day." The day of the Harvest Festival dawned with perfect autumn clarity, crisp morning air giving way to golden sunshine that illuminated Williamsburg's historic district in its most flattering light. From the colonial church spire to the cobblestone streets, from the tavern's weathered sign to the newly restored shop fronts along Market Street, the town presented itself as a living museum where past and present coexisted in harmonious balance. Serafina had been awake since before sunrise, coordinating final preparations with committee members, ensuring that demonstration areas were properly arranged, checking that the local artisans and farmers had everything they needed for their displays. The Trust's involvement had expanded this year's festival beyond its traditional boundaries, incorporating educational elements and historical authenticity, while maintaining the community celebration at its heart. By mid-morning, Duke of Gloucester Street had transformed into a vibrant marketplace reminiscent of colonial times, with the addition of modern amenities discreetly integrated to ensure comfort and accessibility. Craftspeople demonstrated traditional skills, blacksmithing, weaving, candlemaking, woodworking, while explaining historical techniques to fascinated visitors. Local farmers displayed heirloom varieties of apples, squash and corn, offering samples and sharing cultivation stories passed through generations. At the town square, a temporary stage hosted performances by the fife and drum corps, followed by folk musicians playing instruments authentic to different periods of Williamsburg's history. Children participated in colonial games and crafts, their laughter blending with the more measured conversations of adults exploring exhibits about the town's evolving architecture and economy. "You've created something extraordinary," Pastor Williams commented, finding Serafina near the church where volunteers served traditional harvest foods prepared from historical recipes. "I've never seen the festival so vibrant yet so cohesive." "It's been a community effort," she replied modestly, though his words touched her deeply. The trust provided resources, but the vision came from everyone involved. Her gaze swept over the bustling street, noting with satisfaction how seamlessly different elements had come together. Modern families engaging with historical traditions, tourists and locals mingling without the usual separation, educational components enhancing rather than overwhelming the celebratory atmosphere. Most meaningful to Serafina was seeing how the festival created connections across usual social boundaries. Elderly residents shared memories with college students documenting oral histories. Wealthy visitors engaged in conversations with local farmers about sustainable practices. Children from different neighborhoods collaborated on craft projects under the guidance of skilled artisans. Throughout the morning, she caught occasional glimpses of Bartholomew moving through the festival, conferring with Richard Canton near the waterfront exhibit that displayed their collaborative development plans, chatting with James and Catherine as they examined historical documents in the church hall, helping Thomas's younger siblings navigate the apple bobbing contest with unexpected patience and humor. They had agreed to focus on their respective responsibilities during the festival's peak hours, planning to reconnect for the harvest dinner that would culminate the day's celebrations. Yet even in their separate activities, Serafina felt the invisible thread that connected them across the crowded street. A shared purpose, a mutual vision, an unspoken understanding that had deepened since their garden conversation nights before. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the historic district, creating dramatic contrasts between sunlight and shade, Serafina found herself near the temporary exhibition that had been installed in the Trust's headquarters. Entitled Williamsburg Connections, it displayed artifacts, photographs, and documents illustrating how families and traditions had intertwined throughout the town's history. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the letter from Rose Mitchell to William Ashford, carefully preserved behind glass, but transcribed in full so visitors could read the wisdom it contained. Beside it stood a photograph of the Veterans Hospital where they had met, and the small carved bluebird mentioned in the letter, a family treasure that Catherine had contributed to the exhibition after learning of its significance. "It's remarkable, isn't it, Mrs.?" Abernathy's voice interrupted Serafina's contemplation. The elderly historian had been instrumental in assembling the exhibition, her encyclopedic knowledge of Williamsburg genealogy providing connections no one else might have discovered. How lives intersect in ways we never recognize until much later. "That's the true work of preservation," Mrs. Abernathy observed, her eyes bright with the wisdom accumulated through 9 decades of life. "Not just saving buildings or objects, but recognizing the human connections that give them meaning." As evening approached and lanterns were lit throughout the square, the community gathered for the harvest dinner. Hundreds of people seated at long tables that stretched from the church steps to the colonial courthouse. The traditional blessing offered by Pastor Williams acknowledged both the agricultural harvest being celebrated and the less tangible fruits of community connection and reconciliation. Serafina found herself seated between Bartholomew and Eleanor, with Lisa, Catherine, and James across from them. Around them sat a cross-section of Williamsburg society: Thomas and his family, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson from the tavern, Richard Canton and his wife, Mrs. Abernathy, with her great-grandchildren. Families who had lived in the town for generations, alongside newcomers experiencing their first harvest festival. As platters of traditional foods were passed from hand to hand, roasted meats, root vegetables, freshly baked breads, apple and pumpkin desserts, conversations flowed as freely as the local cider and Ashford bourbon that complemented the meal. The atmosphere combined the intimate warmth of family dinner with the expansive inclusivity of true community celebration. Midway through the meal, Mr. Henderson rose from his seat several tables away, tapping his glass for attention. As conversations quieted and faces turned expectantly toward him, he cleared his throat with uncharacteristic nervousness. "For 40 years, I've attended this festival," he began, his voice carrying across the square. "I've watched it change with the times, seen lean years and abundant ones, welcomed new faces and mourned those no longer with us. But I don't believe I've ever witnessed a harvest festival that so perfectly captures what makes Williamsburg special." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering as he continued. "This year we've seen something remarkable happen in our town, not just in this festival, but in the months leading up to it. We've been reminded that true preservation isn't about freezing the past in amber, but about carrying forward the values and connections that give our history meaning." His gaze moved to where Serafina and Bartholomew sat side by side. "Some of you may recall a certain evening at my tavern earlier this year, when a particular waitress had the courage to speak truth to power." Appreciative laughter rippled through the crowd as the confrontation had become something of a local legend. What none of us could have anticipated was how that moment would catalyze changes throughout our community. Mr. Henderson raised his glass in a toast. "To Serafina Mitchell and Bartholomew Ashford, whose unlikely friendship has reminded us all that the divisions we create, between past and present, between different parts of our community, between tradition and progress, exist primarily in our minds, not in our hearts. May their example inspire all of us to seek connection rather than separation." The toast was met with enthusiastic response, glasses raised throughout the square as voices joined in affirmation. Serafina felt color rising in her cheeks at being the center of such public attention, while beside her Bartholomew squeezed her hand beneath the table, a private acknowledgement of the journey they had undertaken together. As dinner concluded, and musicians began setting up for the evening dance that would complete the festival, Bartholomew drew Serafina slightly away from the crowd toward the quieter space near the church gardens, where autumn roses still bloomed despite the cooling temperatures. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," he said, his expression more serious than it had been during the celebratory dinner. "Something I've been considering since before I gave you the ring." Serafina's heart quickened, sensing the significance of the moment. "Yes? The waterfront development will include a residential section, apartments and townhomes designed to integrate with the historical aesthetic while providing modern comfort." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've been working with the architects on a particular unit, a townhouse overlooking the river, with space for a home office, guest rooms for family, and a garden that Eleanor would love." Understanding dawned as he continued. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer, but I wanted you to know that I'm creating a home with us in mind, a place where we might build a life together when you're ready." The thoughtfulness of his approach touched her deeply, not pressuring or rushing, but demonstrating through concrete action his commitment to their shared future, his understanding of what would matter to her in a home, his inclusion of her family in his vision. "I would like to see the plans," she said softly, her response acknowledging his intention without overcommitting before she was certain, "and to contribute ideas, if that's welcome." Relief and joy illuminated his expression. "Nothing would please me more. The space should reflect both of us, just as our relationship has evolved to incorporate both our perspectives." From the town square came the sound of the band beginning its first number, a traditional tune that had accompanied harvest festival dances for generations. Bartholomew offered his hand with formal courtesy that contained a hint of playfulness. "Would you do me the honor of this dance, Miss Mitchell?" She accepted with a smile that conveyed both present joy and future promise. "I would be delighted, Mr. Ashford." As they returned to the square, joining other couples in the traditional patterns of the harvest dance, Serafina was struck by the perfect symbolism of the moment. Two people from different worlds finding synchronicity in movement, surrounded by a community that had witnessed their journey and celebrated their connection. Winter arrived in Williamsburg with gentle persistence, frost etching delicate patterns on colonial windows, holiday wreaths adorning historic doors, occasional snowflakes transforming cobblestone streets into scenes from centuries past. For Serafina and Bartholomew, the season brought both reflection on the remarkable year drawing to a close and anticipation of the possibilities that lay ahead. The Trust's holiday fundraiser, held in the newly completed community center at the waterfront development, marked both the organization's successful first year and the official engagement of its executive director to Bartholomew Ashford, the sapphire ring now worn openly on Serafina's left hand. Their announcement, made quietly to family and close friends after Thanksgiving, surprised no one who had witnessed their evolving relationship. The wedding was planned for early spring, a simple ceremony at St. Matthew's followed by a celebration at their announcement, made quietly to family and close friends after Thanksgiving, surprised no one who had witnessed their evolving relationship. The wedding was planned for early spring, a simple ceremony at St. Matthew's, followed by a celebration at the tavern where their story had begun. You could have any venue in Virginia, Lisa had teased her sister. And you choose the place where you work, where our story began, Serafina corrected gently. The place matters more than its prestige. The choice reflected their shared values, substance over appearance, meaningful connection over social convention, community integration rather than exclusive celebration. As winter deepened, the waterfront development progressed steadily despite occasional snow delays. The townhouse Bartholomew had designed with their future in mind took shape along the river's edge, its architecture honoring colonial traditions while incorporating modern comforts. Serafina had become actively involved in finalizing the interior plans, bringing her practical sensibility and appreciation for authentic materials to complement Bartholomew's vision. The Ashford Mill Distillery, centerpiece of the development's historical elements, attracted increasing attention as word spread about the revival of a traditional bourbon recipe with deep roots in Williamsburg's past. Artisans had been hired to craft copper stills based on 19th-century designs, and a small museum space was being prepared to display artifacts from the original distillery, including ledgers and tools discovered during the archaeological excavation. For Serafina, the Trust's work expanded steadily beyond Williamsburg's boundaries, as neighboring communities sought guidance on preserving their own historical assets while maintaining economic vitality. She found herself traveling throughout the region, speaking at town councils and historical societies, sharing the model that had begun to transform her hometown. One cold January afternoon, she returned from such a meeting to find Bartholomew waiting at her office, an unusual solemnity in his expression. "What is it?" she asked, immediately concerned. "Has something happened?" "I've had news," he replied, his voice carefully controlled, "about the mill workers who were injured alongside my father in the accident." He explained that after months of research, he had located the families of all 7 men affected by the collapse. Most had left Williamsburg after the mill closed, scattered across Virginia and beyond, their financial circumstances permanently altered by injuries that limited their earning capacity. "The Trust has established a special fund," he continued, showing her the documentation he had prepared. "It will provide educational opportunities for their descendants, many of whom never recovered financially from what happened. It won't change the past, but it might help shape a better future." The gesture embodied everything Serafina loved about the man he had become: his capacity for transforming old wounds into healing action, his commitment to making amends rather than merely expressing regret, his growing understanding that true power lay in lifting others rather than controlling them. "This completes the circle," she said softly, recognizing the significance of his action. "From your family being helped after World War I to you helping these families now." "Not completes," he corrected gently. "Continues. That's what I've learned from you. That we're not ending stories but extending them. That our choices now create possibilities for generations we may never meet." The philosophical depth of his observation struck Serafina with its wisdom. How far he had come from the cold, calculating businessman she had confronted that rainy March evening. Yet the transformation hadn't erased his essential nature, his strategic thinking, his attention to detail, his capacity for bold action. Rather, those qualities had been redirected toward more meaningful purposes, integrated with compassion and community awareness that had always existed within him, but had been buried beneath years of protective armor. As January yielded to February, wedding preparations accelerated. Eleanor and Catherine formed an unexpected partnership, combining Eleanor's practical knowledge of meaningful celebrations with Catherine's social connections and resources. Lisa threw herself into designing invitations that incorporated elements of both families' histories, working with a local printer who used traditional letterpress techniques. The guest list reflected the integrated life Serafina and Bartholomew had created: tavern employees, alongside corporate executives, historical society members, beside construction workers from the waterfront project. 3 generations of both Mitchell and Ashford relatives gathered to witness a union that represented far more than the joining of 2 individuals. As Valentine's Day approached, Bartholomew surprised Serafina with an unexpected invitation, not to an elaborate dinner or traditional celebration, but to the veterans' cemetery, where they had first acknowledged the historical connection between their families. "It seems an unusual choice for Valentine's Day," she observed, as they walked among the snow-dusted graves, the winter sun casting long shadows across the peaceful grounds. "I wanted to honor where our journey together truly began," he explained, leading her toward William Ashford's headstone. "Not just at the tavern, but through generations of connection we're only beginning to understand." He had brought a small arrangement of winter greenery and berries to place beside the military marker, a gesture of respect for the grandfather whose life had been saved by Rose Mitchell's nursing care. As they stood together in the quiet cemetery, Bartholomew shared something he had been contemplating. "I've been thinking about the letter your great-grandmother wrote," he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "About kintsugi, the Japanese practice of mending broken pottery with gold, creating something more valuable and beautiful because of its damage rather than despite it." Serafina nodded, remembering the wisdom in Rose's words that had resonated across generations. Finding the broken places, in systems, in buildings, in connections between people, and not just repairing them, but transforming them into something stronger and more beautiful than before. The insight captured perfectly what had been evolving between them and around them. Not just a personal relationship or professional collaboration, but a shared vision that recognized the value in what others might discard, the potential for renewal in what seemed irreparably damaged, the possibility that wounds could become sources of unique strength rather than permanent limitations. "That's what we've been doing together," he continued, taking her gloved hands in his, "not just in our individual lives but for this community." As they walked back toward town, the winter landscape stark but beautiful around them, Serafina reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. How unlikely it had seemed, that rainy night at the tavern, that her impulsive confrontation would lead to such profound transformation, not just in Bartholomew's life or her own, but in the very fabric of the community they both loved in different ways. Yet perhaps it wasn't so unlikely after all. Perhaps some connections were indeed meant to be discovered at precisely the right moment. Some patterns established generations earlier meant to be fulfilled when the time was right. Some courage meant to catalyze changes far beyond what the individual could envision alone. In that recognition lay not just satisfaction with the path they had traveled, but excitement for the road ahead, a journey they would continue together, day by day, choice by choice, building something worthy of all that had brought them to this moment. March returned to Williamsburg exactly 1 year after Serafina's confrontation with Bartholomew in the tavern. Dogwood blossoms opened in delicate profusion, daffodils pushed through warming soil, and the town prepared for the annual renewal that had marked its rhythms for centuries. On the 3rd Saturday of the month, St. Matthew's Church filled with an unusual mixture of guests, tavern employees seated alongside corporate executives, historical society members mingling with construction workers from the waterfront project. 3 generations of both Mitchell and Ashford relatives gathered to witness a union that represented far more than the joining of 2 individuals. The ceremony itself reflected the couple's characteristic thoughtfulness, traditional elements honoring their shared appreciation for history, blended with personal touches that spoke to their unique journey. Pastor Williams incorporated the letter from Rose Mitchell to William Ashford into his remarks, noting how connections established generations earlier had found fulfillment in unexpected ways. Serafina wore a simple ivory gown that Eleanor had modified from her own wedding dress, the vintage sapphire ring, now accompanied by a band Bartholomew had crafted himself in a woodworking class, his first attempt at reconnecting with his grandfather's skills. Though the carving was less perfect than a professional jeweler might have created, its authenticity and meaning made it more precious to Serafina than the most flawless diamond. Bartholomew had surprised her by inviting Thomas to serve as his best man, the young server, whose spilled bourbon had catalyzed their initial confrontation, now standing proudly beside the man who had once intimidated him, but had since become his mentor and educational sponsor. Lisa, as maid of honor, beamed with uncharacteristic solemnity, her usual exuberance tempered by recognition of the moment's significance. When they exchanged vows, the words were both ancient and immediate, promises that had bound couples for generations, given fresh meaning through the specific journey that had brought them to this altar. As Bartholomew slipped the wooden band onto Serafina's finger, his hand steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes, the moment seemed to transcend their individual lives, connecting to patterns of commitment and renewal that had sustained communities through centuries of change. The tavern reception that followed embodied the community they had helped strengthen, barriers between different segments of Williamsburg society dissolving amid shared celebration, connections forming across usual social boundaries, the historic space vibrant with both honored traditions and new possibilities. Mr. Henderson offered the first toast, his voice carrying over the assembled guests. 1 year ago, in this very room, courage met power, and both were transformed. Their story reminds us that the most enduring changes begin not with grand plans, but with simple truth-speaking, and the wisdom to listen when truth is spoken. As evening deepened and celebration continued around them, Bartholomew drew Serafina outside to the cobblestone street, where gas lamps cast golden pools of light against the gathering dusk. Rain threatened in the distance, echoing the weather on the night they had first confronted each other. "I've been thinking about full circles," he said, taking both her hands in his, "about how endings often contain beginnings, and how the most important journeys sometimes return us to our starting points with entirely new perspectives." From his pocket he withdrew a small carved bluebird, an exact replica of the one his grandfather had created for Rose Mitchell, which now resided in the Trust's historical exhibition. "I made this," he explained, the admission containing both vulnerability and pride. "It's taken months of practice, of failed attempts, of rediscovering patience I thought I'd lost forever." The gift represented everything their relationship had nurtured: his reconnection with creative skills long abandoned, his willingness to value process over perfection, his understanding that true worth lay in meaningful effort rather than flawless execution. "It's beautiful," she said simply, cradling the carving with the reverence it deserved, "because of what it is, but even more because of what it represents." As the first raindrops began to fall, reminiscent of that fateful March evening 1 year earlier, they returned to the tavern where their friends and family continued celebrating, not just their marriage, but the community renewal their partnership had helped catalyze. Looking around at the gathering, Eleanor deep in conversation with Catherine, Lisa showing James photographs from her documentary project, Thomas confidently managing the service staff he now supervised, Mr. Henderson and Richard Canton discussing plans for the tavern's historical exhibition, Serafina felt profound gratitude for the unlikely chain of events that had brought them all together. "Ready to go home?" Bartholomew asked softly as the reception began winding down. Home now meaning the riverside townhouse they had designed together, where modern comfort harmonized with historical elements, where space had been created for both shared purpose and individual pursuits. "Yes," she replied, the single word containing layers of meaning, affirmation not just of departure from the celebration, but of the life they had chosen to build together, the values they had committed to upholding, the partnership they would continue developing through whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. As they left the tavern hand in hand, stepping into the gentle spring rain that cleansed winter's remnants from Williamsburg's colonial streets, Serafina recognized that their story had never been simply about two people finding each other against unlikely odds. It had always been about something larger: the ripple effects of courage, the transformative power of authentic connection, the possibility of renewal that exists whenever someone dares to speak truth, and another dares to truly listen. 6 months later, on a perfect autumn evening, much like the one that had concluded their first harvest festival together, Serafina and Bartholomew stood on the balcony of their riverside home, watching sunset colors reflect in the water below. Behind them, through French doors, came sounds of celebration, the annual gathering of their extended family by choice, to mark both the harvest season and the continuing evolution of the community they had helped strengthen. The past months had brought both challenges and triumphs. The Trust had expanded its educational programs throughout Virginia, becoming a model for historical preservation that integrated community needs rather than treating the past as a museum piece. The waterfront development had received national recognition for its balanced approach to economic vitality and environmental stewardship. The Ashford Mill Distillery had produced its first commercial release, with proceeds supporting traditional craft education for local youth. More personally, Serafina and Bartholomew had deepened their partnership through daily collaboration and companionship. Their complementary strengths created balance, her practical wisdom grounding his visionary thinking, his expansive perspective broadening her focused approach, their different backgrounds providing diverse insights that neither would have accessed alone. "What are you thinking?" Bartholomew asked, joining her at the railing with glasses of the special reserve bourbon created for their 6-month anniversary. "About that night at the tavern," she replied. "How neither of us could have imagined where that confrontation would lead." He smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in the way that had become increasingly natural through their relationship. "I remember thinking you were either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish to challenge me that way. Perhaps a bit of both," she acknowledged with a laugh, "though I prefer to call it principled rather than foolish." "Principled indeed." He raised his glass in a small toast. "To the courage that changes lives, both the courage to speak truth and the courage to hear it." Inside their home, their guests represented every facet of their intertwined lives. Eleanor and Catherine discussed plans for the community garden they had established together. Lisa shared photographs from her university documentary project with James and Pastor Williams. Thomas, now assistant manager at the tavern, while pursuing his business degree, engaged Richard Canton in a thoughtful conversation about historical business practices. Margaret, who had transitioned from corporate administration to becoming the Trust's operations director, conferred with Mr. Henderson about the upcoming historical exhibition at the tavern. Nearby, Mrs. Abernathy entertained younger guests with vivid stories connecting Williamsburg's past to its present. "We've created quite the extended family, haven't we?" Bartholomew observed, his gaze taking in the diverse gathering with evident satisfaction. "Family by choice, rather than merely by circumstance," Serafina agreed, though the circumstances that brought us together were rather extraordinary. As evening deepened and conversation flowed throughout their home, Serafina found herself reflecting on the profound truth their journey had revealed, that the most enduring transformations begin not with grand visions, but with simple courage, the willingness to speak truth, to hear it, to allow it to reshape assumptions and redirect paths. The confrontation that had sparked their connection had been just one moment, significant but brief, a single pebble dropped into the stream of community life. Yet the ripples from that moment had touched countless lives, catalyzing changes neither could have anticipated when they first encountered each other across the tavern table. Most meaningful was the recognition that their story continued unfolding, not a completed narrative but an ongoing evolution, not a finished structure but a foundation for whatever would emerge in the years ahead. The trust they had built, both the organizational entity and the personal bond, provided stability while allowing for growth and adaptation as circumstances changed and new challenges arose. When their guests had departed and they stood together in the quiet of their home, Bartholomew drew Serafina into his embrace, the familiar gesture containing both comfort and promise. "Do you remember what you said to me that night at the tavern?" he asked. "Your exact words." She smiled at the memory. "I believe I said that having enough money to buy the tavern didn't give you the right to treat people as if they were invisible." "Those words changed everything," he acknowledged. "Not immediately, not completely, but they created the first crack in walls I had spent decades building." The admission touched her deeply. His willingness to acknowledge vulnerability, to recognize the impact of her courage, to value truth-speaking as a gift rather than a threat. "And now?" she asked softly. His response encompassed everything their journey had revealed. "Now we continue building something neither of us could have created alone, a life where no one is invisible, where courage and compassion guide our choices, where the echoes of our actions carry forward in ways that honor all that brought us to this moment." As moonlight streamed through their windows, illuminating the home they had created together, Serafina recognized that they had indeed built something remarkable, not just in their personal relationship or professional collaboration, but in the community that had been transformed through their combined influence. The journey that had begun with confrontation had evolved into partnership, the differences that might have divided them instead enriching their shared vision, the challenges they had faced strengthening rather than weakening their connection. In the quiet of their home, surrounded by the tangible results of their shared vision, the protected waterfront, the revitalized historical district, the expanded opportunities for community members of all backgrounds, they stood at the threshold of a future neither could have imagined separately, but both now embraced wholeheartedly together. The most profound echoes are not those that merely repeat what has been, but those that carry forward the essential truth while creating new harmonies. When courage meets receptivity, when conviction encounters openness to change, when different perspectives unite in shared purpose, the reverberations extend beyond individual lives to touch communities, to reshape environments, to create legacies that continue long after the original voices have faded. In those enduring echoes, we find our truest immortality, not in monuments or possessions, but in lives transformed, in possibilities expanded, in the courage we inspire in others to speak their own truth and create their own harmonies in the unfolding symphony of human connection.